Welcome to the Meru Media podcast with Mukunda.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Meru Media podcast. We have an amazing guest today, Professor Stephen Phillips, who is a professor, is kind of in between at the University of Texas at Austin, I believe. And he is the author of a couple books here that I've read. There's a few more. So one is Yoga, Karma, and Rebirth, which is a fantastic work on basically the history and the flow of the ideas of yoga, karma, and rebirth, as the title says. And the other one is the Epistemology of Perception, which is a text by, I believe, a 12th, 13th century philosopher by name of Geshe called Tattva Chintamani. Professor Phillips, please welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking your time and your semi-retirement to have a conversation with us.
Okay, namaskara.
Namaskara. So, Professor, what's your background? How did you get really involved into getting into studying Sanskrit and the Hindu tradition, and what kind of drew you into it? Because one of the feelings I also got from your book on yoga was that you're actually probably an avid yogi too. So can you explain that process?
Well, let's see. I just noticed. So I'm in the process of moving into retirement, and so I don't have my whole library, but I do have this book that I was lucky. I was a smart teenager who got a scholarship to a prep school. I'm not from a wealthy family, and I did very well at the prep school and got a very good scholarship to Harvard College, and that was in 1968. At the time of the Vietnam War and I don't know, emergence of the counterculture.
Sure.
I don't know the racism in particular of the U.S. and I was quite anti-war. I gave an anti-war speech at as part of my graduation ceremonies. I'm very proud of it in 1968, and quite shocking. And it was in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Is that where you're from?
No, but that's where the high school was.
Okay.
So then I got a chance. There's a program at Harvard called Volunteers for Africa. It was a little bit like the Peace Corps. So I dropped out after my sophomore year. I was a philosophy major. Mm-hmm. Wasn't doing particularly well because I don't know. It was a time I had a course with a great philosopher, Hilary Putnam. I wouldn't have had my career had Harvard not called off classes in the spring of, I think it was 1970, because Nixon bombed Cambodia, because I had, I think, a D in philosophy of science under Putnam, and he gave us all A's. And called off course and told us to march on Washington. In any case, the next year I went to Africa. I went to Kenya. And while I was in Kenya, there was some lady, I just started reading various stuff, and there was a book called The Adventure of Consciousness about a yogi named Sri Aurobindo. And I stole that book and borrowed some money from a tourist.
You stole it from where?
From the lady who loaned it to me. She was some old British colonialist who, let, I don't know, Western hitchhikers stay at her house and so on. I was working. I was really bad. I quit. And I took that book and I just started traveling, hitchhiking up through the desert of Kenya and Ethiopia. And I went to a kibbutz eventually got to a kibbutz in Israel, where I ordered more books from the Sri Aurobindo ashram and then went on to India on a student ID card. I traveled from Firozapur to what was called Madras, Chennai, this is 1971 early, for 51 rupees. And then I went to the Sri Aurobindo ashram. They sent most of the young hippies out to Oroville, right?
Yeah.
But for some reason, there was a guy named Madhav Pandit. I was only 20 years old, who, I don't know, he put me in with some ashramites.
Right.
And, you know, I cleaned up and I don't know, started reading. I still have, and then I worked on, there's this temple out in the, where they started this town called Oroville.
Mm-hmm. I've been there, yeah.
And so I still have, I read, right, most people were like digging the hole for this temple, the Matra Mandir.
Uh-huh.
This book right here is The Synthesis of Yoga by Sri Aurobindo, that it's got all that clay Oroville soil on it from
The red soil. Yeah.
Where, yeah, I read that. And then I started making friends, Upendra Sharma in particular, some people who were going to the Sri Aurobindo Ashram School, International Center for Education. And I said, God, I'd like to go to this school. And so they said, well, just write a letter to the mother. I did. She accepted me.
Wow.
And so I went to school. So I went back to the U.S. and got some money, went to Harvard for one semester, got some money, and then lived in, went to school in the International Center for Education, where they, you know, that's where I started studying Sanskrit. And they speak Sanskrit there. They teach it to the, and so they taught me to speak Sanskrit a little bit. I was not very good, but it did, you know, and then I had a long, you know, over the years I went back. I spent, I don't know, I guess almost 6 years off and on there. Mm-hmm. And I had Jagannatha, Vedalankara, Chinmay, Maheshwari, and several other teachers who, even though Chinmay says that I spoke Sanskrit like with you know, one of those logs that you bar a door with in my throat. But still, I could speak well enough that I could speak to South Indian pundits like N.S. Ramana Chattarachari, with whom I did that book. Mm-hmm. So maybe he knew a little English, but he couldn't speak English. So I was able to do that book. Gangesha is a really important figure with a lot of commentary. It's very difficult philosophically. Sanskrit is not as elliptical as some, but still quite difficult. But he is an editor. I was really fortunate. He was one of the great editors, and you know, pundits. And they have once at the French Institute there, they had a Brahmodia, and he was in charge. And all the pundits came from all over India, you know, arguing in Sanskrit. He was just terrific. And I think they've even had a conference in his honor since he passed away a few years ago. Mm-hmm. He, you know, wrote original material in Nyaya on Gangesha and others. Anyway, so we sat down and read text for every, I don't know, Hawaii tried to, I mean, after I went back to, got my PhD, went back to Harvard, went to Harvard Graduate School and so on, I continued my association with India, but, you know, with every fellowship I got, I'd always go back there.
Right.
But Hawaii tried to hire me one time. And so in order to keep me, I got a deal from the University of Texas to do a split teaching so that I taught a heavy load through December and then half courses beginning in March. And so I went to India every year for about, I don't know, 8 or 9 years in a row. Wow. In the 90s and 2000 from December to April. This is in addition to 6 years I lived there at the Sri Aurobindo Ashram and you know, graduate studies and so on, going back and forth, and eventually with my wife. This was in addition to that. And so I went, you know, and we would just read Sanskrit every day for about, you know, 3 to 4 months at a time. And that's how I was able to translate the Tattva Chintamani, which is, you know, like I say, it's, you know, it's late and very dense philosophy, quite subtle in its arguments and presupposes a lot of familiarity with the other schools and so on. So with his help, he gave me a running commentary in Sanskrit, in sort of simpler Sanskrit, and I tape recorded it. Wow. And I'd go back to Texas, right, and work on it. And even when I would commute, I'd put his Sanskrit tapes into the car, as I had about a 45-minute commute, and listen to it. So I don't know, my ability to, I've fallen off a little bit, but
sure.
That's how I got to, and so, I don't know, from the get-go, I was a specialist in classical Indian philosophy. That's why University of Texas hired me even.
Right.
They may, I don't know. Surely there are people who are better philosophers than Sanskritists in this area, but I don't know, maybe, the éclat of Harvard or something. I got a job and just sort of held on in the philosophy department. Kind of rare, right? And there are not very many people in philosophy departments who have my specialization.
Sure.
So I had to teach their, regular courses, as well as they let me teach always one course on classical Indian philosophy every year. And finally, I got it up, so that's all I was doing. Right. But at first, I had to teach, introduction to logic, introduction to ethics, theory of knowledge, just the regular, palette of philosophy. And then, one of the 4 courses each year would be something in classical Indian philosophy, or even modern, like Neo-Vedanta.
Sure.
Radhakrishna. Okay, there's my background.
So when you were in your PhD program, you did philosophy, right? So were you?
Yeah, I combined Sanskrit and philosophy. Since I've been an undergraduate at Harvard, when I got into the Harvard Graduate School, I was a good friend with Robert Nozick as an undergraduate, and so he and the Sanskrit guy, Ingalls, allowed me to do a combined degree.
Right. I actually learned, maybe it was around the same time you were there, I learned from Sanskrit from Dr. Prem Singh from University of Delhi, who at the time also was probably in the late 60s, early 70s, he was a student of Ingalls too.
What's his name?
Dr. Prem Singh. He was in the linguistics department in Delhi, Delhi University. But I think he's passed away since then. Ingalls is obviously a luminary within especially in the Harvard field in Sanskrit, right?
But Ingalls, but Nozick was the guy, I'm telling you, who was really my mentor more than Ingalls. Ingalls was just a disciplinarian. It made you a test every day in Sanskrit class, because you had to read and translate in front of me, and hardly ever opened his mouth except to say, "Oh, Mr. Phillips, that is not an absolute, ablative singular. That's a nominative plural, you idiot."
But at this time, you spent years in India studying Sanskrit with other Sanskritists, right?
Yeah, that's right. With classical pundits and people who had learned, Panini instead of the Western grammatical categories. Ingalls, used the Latin categories. So in a way, I had to start all over again with him, as opposed. But I had a leg up on a lot of the students because I had, 2, 3. By the end of it, 4 or 5 years of Sanskrit study in India.
So, how did the comparative method or pedagogy of Sanskrit taught in India, in the Indian method versus the Western method, how does that?
Well, I don't know. It depends on the different people. I remember I had my next to last year as a graduate student, I got a Fulbright and spent a year in India, and I went to a Varanasi study, and there was this way of studying that was very sort of teacher intensive. We'd read a text, but the teacher would translate it or something. And I just would tell the pundit that, I'm sorry, I got to be more active than that.
Mm-hmm.
The same with Ramanujanatacharya. We just read the lines together. then I'd have to say spushtum, right?
Right.
Or spushtum to keep him getting to go on. And yeah, there I was, he was such a great man. I was, I didn't interrupt so much, but I did with my ashram teacher, Jagannatha Vedalankara, who was really brilliant, intellectual, and traditionally trained. We got to be friends. He went, one year we went, we lived in a hill station together. And with my wife, I got married. And yeah, he was quite amenable to what I want to do. And we would sit down and read classical text.
Right. So can you tell us, like, how was it at that time? I mean, this was probably when a lot more Western people were coming into India to get more into the spirituality, yoga, and Sanskrit, and these things. How did the traditional pundits, Ramanuja Tatacharya probably was traditional pundit. How did they respond to teaching, this some of this esoteric knowledge, or things that might have been only kept within the community?
Well, first of all, in the Sri Aurobindo ashram, there was a real effort to be, what should we say, internationalist or global. I don't know. Many people have been surprised that Ines Ramanuja Tatacharya would study with me. I don't think he would have eaten. I don't think he would eat with me.
Right. Right.
But I think because of my interest in yoga, he thought of me as a non-exploiter or something. I don't know.
Okay.
I have a friend, I won't name his name, who is he's grown up in Indian, and he's not a Brahmin and doesn't have a sacred thread. And he tells me Ramanuja Tatacharya would not study with him.
Interesting. Yeah.
And there are other pundits, and he's been told, he said, well, just put on a thread. You know Sanskrit so well. Just put the thread on. He said, no, I can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, did you learn Tamil at all when you were in art?
I learned a little bit. I'm sorry. I should have learned more. But no, I was, hey, I'm not all that great in languages. And so, Sanskrit's enough. I tried. And there was a good friend of mine in Texas who recently passed away, Shankaran Radhakrishnan, was a great Tamil instructor. He wrote a textbook in Tamil.
Yeah. And
he lived in Pondicherry for a while and had a house in Mysore. I made some effort to learn the alphabet and so on, but I don't know. I know that High Tamil has a lot of Sanskrit loan words. But it's not an Indo-European language. There's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I gave up.
No, it makes sense. I mean, the only reason I know Tamil is because my family is, right? So I grew up learning both Tamil and Kannada as my first languages.
Oh,
and then my dad taught me bits of Sanskrit when I was young. And then so the pronunciation, all the prayers and stuff, my father taught me. So I had a good basis in all these languages. I could read Tamil very slowly. But High Tamil.
You know the Devanagari alphabet.
Oh, Devanagari I could read. Yeah, that I could read much quicker.
That's real, and it's not just Tamil. I mean, every South Indian language has a slight Malayalam and different alphabet. I mean, it's not like you can just. So I've lived in different places. The place I like to go now is Kerala. That's where they got all these Ayurvedic hotels down there at the
that's right.
Overland and so on. You're in Los Angeles, but gosh, that's a beautiful country down there. I like Tamil Nadu and everything, but there's also a few Sanskrit Vidyapitas that I've thought about retiring in, but anyway, right now I'm in New Mexico.
So when you were also doing your PhD, did you also have to do Greek and learn like the? No.
I was strictly a philosophy person.
Okay.
Who got interested in yoga and Indian spirituality. Went to the Sri Aurobindo ashram, and there started learning Sanskrit and became a Sanskritist as well as a philosopher. Now, I did also, when I was on the Fulbright for a year in Varanasi, I learned some Hindi, and my wife is fluent in Hindi.
Yeah.
And so, and also, Hindi, there are a lot of Hindi commentaries on Sanskrit texts. Like, I remember one in Sri Harsha, the Kandana Kanda Kanya, has a really nice Hindi commentary. And, it's such high Hindi. Once you know ki ke ka, things like that, it's really just a kind of Sanskrit.
Like a Prakrit, yeah.
without the genitive case and so on, right? Yeah. So I can, and I because of the community of speaking there in Pondicherry and also with Ramana Chattarjee and others, speaking Sanskrit a little bit, also with some colleagues like Arindam Chakrabarti, speaking Sanskrit. I can, when I don't really speak Hindi, but I start speaking and I say pustak instead of kitab.
Yeah.
And so people think, oh, you know such high Hindi. I don't know Hindi at all. but hey, I can pass.
So what are your thoughts that in order to do Indian philosophy, one must know Sanskrit, right? Like with the Western world, you don't necessarily have to know Greek.
Well, I tell you, I do. I have, with Plato and Aristotle and other Greek philosophers there's such long traditions of translation and commentary on them that you can be a specialist in Aristotle and not really know Greek.
Right.
It's possible. I mean, I think at the best universities, the Aristotle and Plato specialists do know Greek, but plenty of people teach Greek philosophy.
Right.
Hey, I've lectured on Plato and Aristotle. I know nothing of Greek. And that's just sort of common in the world of philosophy. But classical Indian philosophy has not been digested to the same extent by the Anglophone philosophic community, so that I don't know. I think I'm looking for the time where there can be people who really are specialists in Indian philosophies who don't know Sanskrit, or just some the special terms. Brahman, Vyapti, I don't know.
Sure.
But I don't think that time has come yet. So when I've had graduate students,
right,
I have 6 successful PhD students who've gotten jobs in academia. Right. And I've made all of them learn Sanskrit.
And one of the reasons I ask is, obviously Vyakarana is such a huge part of any sort of textual exegesis or hermeneutics, right? And especially when you get to the Vedantic section where they have to, work through Brahma Sutra, the Upanishads, and the Gitas, the words and how grammar plays is so important in their philosophical traditions. Do you see that being overcome, or do you see any corollary on the Western side that would kind of be like, I guess, a precedence as to how that would change on the India side?
Well, actually, I think I may disagree with you slightly on Vyakarana, which does not seem so important to me in the Vedantic tradition that runs through the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita on into classical Vedanta. It seems to me that the central ideas there can be rendered. I mean, sometimes the poetry is not rendered very well, but it's really more in Nyaya and even more than Nyaya, in Mimamsa,
right,
where the language is important. Nyaya is important because of logic and fallacies, which you want to say, okay, that spills over into Vedanta, but Vedanta is so much concerned with, upasana, bhava. I see Vedanta as a tradition centered on the practice of meditation and other forms of yoga, and aiming at a kind of transformed person with a mystic psychology, as you can tell from my yoga book, etc. And surely, I mean, I know there's a tradition in Vedanta that, from Padmapada, that, the Mahavakyas, Tatvamasi, Soham, and so on, are thought of as triggers of mystical awareness, of yogic awareness. And I know, Ramanuja is one of the ones that criticize them. But even in that Shankara tradition, Padmapada is not the only voice. I mean,
True.
and Shankara, sure, he has respect for the Mahavakyas, but, Dhamma, right? What is it? Dhamma Yama Dhyadi Yukta, right? You got to be self-controlled, calm, etc. Those are the real prerequisites, right? And he's so, and yeah, of course, and Nyaya has, Kashkandesa has this real, sort of ongoing battle with Mimamsa, how to understand injunctions and testimony and so on. Yeah, there it's very important. I don't think it's so much the grammar in the narrow sense, but grammar, it's more like qualification, bits of knowledge or thoughts. An entity is qualified, like you have an individual that is qualified by being a tree. So you say that's a tree, or cow. You say, cow. And so that gets analyzed by Nyaya, that there is an individual qualified by the universal cowhood. And so there, in any verbalizable thought, there's really two elements. There's what is qualified, or the qualificandum, that sort of particular thing that has various attributes like cowhood, but also other ones like, I don't know, living a certain period of time, being a certain color, I don't weight, and so on. So that's really feeds into logic. But and Vedanta, sure, Vedanta learns from Nyaya about how to argue, and so you might want to say, that comes into Vedanta, but that's not really their focus. Their focus is on the message of the Upanishads,
right,
and these large metaphysical issues, right? And those large metaphysical issues and the reason, the reasoning about those metaphysical issues, I don't think is really so language dependent.
No, in that sense, I would agree with you, right? Because if you look at the Nyaya text, and you point this out both in your yoga book and I think in Gangesha's too, is that even though they might argue for Ishvara, they don't really have any sense of what Ishvara is or is not, or the qualities, where the Vedantic texts spend all their time talking about who Ishvara is. And
that's right.
Yeah.
Nyaya is kind of minimalist. They say, okay, Ishvara has to be sarvajña.
Yeah.
In order to do what Ishvara needs to do, which also Ishvara has to be vibhu in order to be able to put together atoms which ordinarily are not conjoined, and so Ishvara has to have that ability. But we don't speculate about Ishvara's nature beyond what we need to complete our metaphysical system.
Right.
To see, things like, how macro objects come to be, et cetera, et cetera. So Ishvara has, sort of the ideas of Ishvara, I don't know, we arrive at them by inference from other positions we know, that are maybe empirically or experientially known, but that's not the way Vedanta or Mimamsa proceeds,
right?
And so, and with Vedanta, I don't know. I know that I have, I don't know, a certain perspective on this that comes out of my life in the Sri Aurobindo ashram, my interest in yoga, and so on. But again, I see Vedanta as centered on some special experiences, Brahma Sakshatkara,
Yeah.
meditation, an inner world, the Upanishads, the 4 stages of the self and sleep and so on and so forth. Those seem to me not so dependent on language. I mean,
Yeah,
look,
I agree.
there are certain things like chanting Om.
Yeah.
I don't know, that seem to me magical. I can't give any rational explanation for it.
Yeah.
Or even some mantras, I don't know. There's some that my Jagannatha Vedalankara taught me that I love and chant all the time. I love chanting those. But even those have meaning, Apyantu mamangani vakpanas chakshushrotram mato balamindriyani cha sarvani sarvam brahmo panasharam maham brahma nirakuryam mama brahma nirakarot nirakanamastu taratmani nirateyo panashatsu dharmas te mai santu om shanti shanti shanti. And I don't know, those are great, those are wonderful, but there's still, that mantra says, may I have the qualities of those who are meditating on the self as talked about in the Upanishads. So it's not really the mantras, it's the ideas, right?
Sure.
It's the qualities of the, self, et cetera, et cetera. So that seems to me, so I think it's unfortunate that Vedanta sometimes has become too text-centered as opposed to yoga, because I see the Upanishads as really yogic texts.
Interesting. I mean, I in some sense I do too, right? Because they're not forming a necessarily Vedantic ideology at that point. They're explaining their experiences in a format of either a dialectic or a dialogue,
or poetry, or sometimes poetry, punning. What did the sun thunder say in the where the gods and the humans and the asuras come up and ask Prajapati, give us an Upanishad. One of the few times the word Upanishad is used in the Upanishad. And each group, he says, duh.
Duh, yeah.
Duh. And they interpret it differently, right? Which is so interesting, right?
Right.
What is it? The gods, damyata, control yourself.
Yeah.
Don't play all the time, right? Humans, datta, give.
Give, yeah.
And the demons, damyata, control yourself. Dhyadvam, be compassionate.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's not. What is that? That's sort of like a parable. I don't know. It's in a way. It's kind of. It's poetic, and I don't know. It's sort of for contemplation how different groups, even Shankara says this is for different parts of our being. The higher parts of ourselves need to restrain themselves. Human parts of us need to be giving, practice karma yoga instead of taking, and the lower parts of ourselves need to be compassionate.
Right.
So I don't know, what is that? That's in a way a kind of wisdom text, but it seems to be related to a yogic discipline, right? Of these.
Right. I mean, many of these doctrines that, in Vedantic Upanishad are really based on this yogic sense of, of sensing the inner self and how to get through these various layers.
How to get through, the different kosha, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The kosha and the prana kosha and the manomaya kosha and so on, to get this thing that survives death, right? And and Yajnavalkya go off and they'll talk, eyes, let me give you the deep thing here, what's going on.
Right.
Yeah. So, no, I think a lot of classical Vedanta philosophy gets a little too obsessed with proof texts.
Right.
So that the Vishishta Advaita Vedantins throw certain text at the Advaita Vedantins, counter with another text, and they just.
But I mean, but that's more on the Palomic side, right? In their
Yeah,
each of their particular sadhanas or practices,
yeah, that's true.
they change. They don't even really care about the Vedantic test. Like for example, in Vishishtadvaita system, it's all about the Divya Prabandhams. They're more concerned with the esoteric experience of Krishna, Vishnu, Rama, whatever.
Yeah. But they don't write about that so much.
Right, right.
So that when you look at the philosophy, sometimes it does seem like a little bit of, I don't know, yeah, sort of theology.
Yeah, it's a
But
lot of wrangling with each other about the right
yeah,
conception of things.
yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah, and, yeah.
but to me it's also funny because like when you go into the practice within the Hindu world, no one really cares about these like theological philosophical
Yeah,
differences
I know.
outside of talking to each other when you have a vada or
Yeah,
sambhava.
that's why the Neo Vedanta is really wonderful. It seems to me, Radhakrishnan and many others. Yeah, I think there's a whole slew of really interesting Neo Vedantins. Swami Vivekananda, Mahatma Gandhi himself. That sort of read the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, but don't really pay so much attention to the Brahma Sutra
Right,
or the disputes within the sub schools.
right. No, it's interesting to me because I think like you brought this point up briefly in your yoga book, but I think in some ways modern Hindu thought has taken on the Jain idea of syat, right? Kind of like this, maybe that, maybe, and it's kind of like it's become this very hodgepodgey perspectival.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Hmm.
I mean, that's just a perspective I have. I'm not entirely sure if
No,
that's
I know. Look, this Syadvada, and I find all that very interesting. And I think I think it's tied to ahimsa, and I think there's something really wonderful about um, trying to see things from another's point of view.
right.
And Shankara, in his Gita commentary, talks about ahimsa as seeing, seeing yourself in the other, and knowing that, just like myself, another doesn't like pain,
Right.
uh, and and the Chinas are really fair,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's. I think it's misinterpreted slightly because the Chinas actually try to refute people. They'll be fair, but they do, argue for a particular view. And yes, that outline of a book that I'm working on, or
Mm-hmm.
may well work on, about Shankara and Aurobindo on the Isha Upanishad and other things. I think what I'd really like to see is more unity in Vedanta, and interest in the sort of metaphysics, the theistic metaphysics, or metaphysics of Brahman, as a kind of real contender, instead of this squabbling
Yeah.
among so okay, we're Hindus, they're Muslims, they're Christians,
Right.
we have our stuff. Oh, okay, well, we can, or we have our text. Well, there may be some question about how to interpret it and so on. No, I guess being in this way an outsider, and I don't know, a globalist. I feel that Radhakrishnan and Aurobindo and others tried to do this, sort of present a more unified tradition of sort of not ignoring the different views that are expressed even in the Upanishads themselves. I mean, the Chandogya is a little different from the Brihadaranyaka, et cetera, but finding or following out the real interests, which have to do with a kind of theism and metaphysics of the absolute Brahman, along with ways to know that in a very direct way, non-intellectually,
Right.
through personal experience. That seems to me to be the real heart of Vedanta. And, you know, in the squabbling sub-schools, you can sort of miss the forest for the
Right.
trees.
Right. No, and I agree, because I mean, sometimes, like, what I end up thinking about is how much can our logic and our ability to think actually help us understand any experience or yogic perception or a divine experience of the world that we would have. I don't know if the intellectual capacity of human beings is
Yeah, can be.
capable of.
Okay.
Sorry, everyone. I got technical difficulties, so I got cut off. But as I was saying, and I was briefly in the interim, was talking to Professor Phillips, the difficulty or the maybe impossibility of trying to understand the universe from the perspective of either Brahman or Brahmajnana is vis-a-vis logic, inference. And you were talking about Sriharsha, so if you want to go ahead and like his response to this.
Yeah, Shankara has in the second book of the Brahma Sutra, where the various schools, he has these great refutations of other systems, and you know, and even when it comes to creation, he says, you know, there are lots of different views of creation, and you get this idea that you know, that you live in a Vidya, you're not going to be able intellectually to put together the way the world somehow looks from Brahman's perspective and
Right.
everything else you know in the prapancha, the world of vyavahara, of everyday experience. And so that's a thing that's also in Buddhism, in Nargarja. And there's this great Sanskrit author I think of the 11th century named Sriharsha, who not only wrote the Kanda Kadya, delectables of refutation, the mass of them, that were mainly focused on the problems in Nyaya, where he says, give it up, you Nyaya, because you're not going to be able to intellectually figure out the world. You need to just pull back and meditate, find the true self. and he also wrote an unbelievably beautiful, polished, epic poem named the Naishada Charita,
Mm-hmm.
where, I mean, there's one place in that poem where you might say, oh, it's didactic. No, it's I think one of the great moments in world literature where Damayanti, it's taken with the story taken from the
Mahabharata, yeah.
Mahabharata, where Damayanti has a Swayamvara, and so she's already in love with Nala, who's been reported to her in various ways. But she's so beautiful that four of the gods, I think it's Agni, Indra, I think Yama, and I've forgotten the other, maybe Varun. I don't know. The four gods are in love with her, and so they imitate.
Nala, yeah.
They put on a disguise as Nala. So there are five Nalas, one true Nala, and four gods. And so who does he have as the master of ceremonies? Saraswati, the goddess of speech. And so introducing these suitors for her hands, she says each time one comes in a bit of poetry that can be read two ways. So it can, one way, it's slasha, double entendre, or double meaning. One way it's read, it's a description of Nala, and the other way it's a description of Agni. And the next one, it's again a description of Nala, or read another way, a description of
Indra, yeah.
and so on, and through the five, and so Damayanti's confused. She doesn't see the double entendre, which is very subtle.
Yeah.
And so then she prays and meditates, and a voice says to her, study the words of Saraswati. She goes back and she gets the double meaning and is able then to recognize the true Nala, whom she chooses as her husband. And then he says, that's kind of like Advaita Vedanta. You have to be able to see through the false, false pretender. But I just think that's wonderful. I mean, because most, if you're going to write a work of art, it's really hard, and you try to lower expectations.
Right.
But what does Sri Harsha do? Saraswati, he puts words in the mouth of Saraswati. I mean, what higher expectations for poetry could you have? And what he does is come up with the most beautiful double entendres.
Right.
I think that's one of the great. Anyway, so he wrote a work of philosophy. I mean, he's an anti-intellectual, but he's the most intellectual person imaginable, right?
Right.
Because, in his ability to show how we're not really able to put it all together.
Right.
In the context of some deeper experience of your own self and consciousness.
So given all this, how did you decide that you wanted to study Gangesha?
I must say that was pretty much a career move, because Nyaya is the philosophy that is sort of the most similar to contemporary analytic philosophy. And also Nyaya is Nyaya means critical reasoning, right? The technical,
Right.
Nyaya, the small n. And so, in traditions from, Plato, Aristotle, and so on, philosophy, the field, the métier, the skills are argument. So, I love yoga and mystical experience, but as a teacher and a professional academic and so on, and a philosopher, it's argument. And Nyaya teaches all the schools argument, fallacies, right? The Hetuambasas and Nigrahastanas, all the fallacies and so on. And as an employee of a university, I had to teach baby logic all the time.
Right.
Critical reasoning and so on. And also Nyaya was understudied. Plus, look, there's all this literature in Vedanta, but some of the schools like Sankhya and Yoga, there really isn't so much literature. But Nyaya has a rich, long tradition. And I don't know, just sort of looking around and what my colleagues were interested in, et cetera, and sort of the state of the profession, and that has a specialization in the study of classical Indian philosophies. I just saw Gangesha as the guy who was the least accessible, who should be accessible.
Right.
And then I was lucky enough to be able to find Ramanujacharya, who's a great Nyayika, but in his heart of hearts, he's a Vishishta Dvaita Vedanta, and he had.
Right.
So that's not unusual for people to have a sort of professional outside as a teacher and philosopher as a Nyayika. I was kind of like a traditional pundit in that way. But, in their heart of hearts, they, really love the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads.
So how did they end, maybe even you, how did you or them end up reconciling being such an expert on this particular tradition, but also having these different emotional, philosophical commitments?
Oh, I don't know. A lot of people are like that, right? I mean,
no, I mean they are, but but given some of these arguments can really cut to the core of other traditions, the traditions you believe. Do you find that there is a lot of churn? Because one of my concerns and these are things I've brought up with other scholars, is also, are we at this point so fixed on these schools as they were back 500 years ago, that we're not seeing the development of these schools due to new arguments and new evidence and new methodologies?
I think the Neo-Vedantins should be better appreciated. but I don't know. They're just, it seems to me that the not just in universities in the United States and Europe and so on, but in India itself, the richness of the classical tradition is not appreciated in the academic sphere.
Right.
I mean, there may be some aesthetics, rasa aesthetics, and so on, and I don't know, in linguistics they may study Panini a little bit and so on, but there's a kind of break with the coming of science and so on. I mean, it's not just in India, but I'd say China.
Sure.
So, and I don't know. I take it that N.S. Ramanujathanachari and others like Jagannatha Vedalankara and others that I studied with, they really weren't part of the academic system of India, right? I mean, the Vidyapitas, they may say, the Vishwa Vidyapita, that's supposed to be deemed a university, but it's not really looked at in India as on the same level as a university where, I don't know, geology and biology and all those sciences are taught. And so there needs to be a lot more integration, it seems to me, and study of the classical traditions. And I don't say that as, I don't know, as in a political way,
sure,
a kind of retrenchment into your own tradition, but just having a sense of the richness of the classical tradition. And it seems like there was a kind of break with colonialism, and there should be more integration.
Yeah. Because, I mean, like, even if you look at the history of Nyaya, you go Nyaya, then it becomes Namya Nyaya, joins in the Visheshika, and then you have the Nyaya Gangesha. But then at some point, there's a continuity of change that's happening. But I feel like some point, what we're doing, especially people like me included, is we're just looking at the past and not thinking about how do these concepts apply to the world we're engaging with. Like, for example, how does Nyaya play a role in
There's a book that you didn't look. See this? Can you see this book?
Yeah, I see it. Okay.
Yeah, I'm a little embarrassed. It's a little expensive. I think they came out in paperback, but it's called Epistemology in Classical India.
Is that from Routledge?
Yeah, Routledge. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll get that then.
I don't know. I take up the Gettier problem at the end from a Nyaya perspective.
Yeah.
And I think I actually, and I also argue in some other places in the introduction to the translation of Gangesha's Tatra Chintamani, they've got, it's not entirely free of problems, but as a theory of knowledge of the everyday world, I'm not talking about yoga and knowledge of Brahman at this point, but just, there's a cup on the table, here we are talking on computers, knowledge like that. It's a fantastic system. It's what's called an externalist system. It talks about causal connections between the objects and the knowers.
Right.
On and on and on. And it's quite detailed. It has, and I don't know, it's recommendable. To me, it should be a player in totally contemporary epistemology.
No, and I agree. I've always, because right now all you end up reading about is Vedanta connected to quantum physics, how, it's all like whoop-de-woo and everything.
That's hard to see, but
yeah,
Nyaya's having an epistemology of everyday knowledge is easy to see.
Right.
It has to do with perception, inference, and testimony. Also, there's something called analogy.
Sure.
It's a little arcane, but it's a very straightforward system, very sort of common sense, and I don't know.
So my question to you, and then in like, for example, in perception, right? In both, in the Indian system, or at least Nyaya in some sense, even Samkhya, when you perceive an object, for it to be a proper cognition or truthful cognition, it has to see the object as it is, right?
That's right.
Not through some sort of representationalism, which in some sense, like in current biology, right? Don't we think about the world through representationalism? So how would Nyaya contend with biological understanding or neurological understanding of perception?
No problem. The transmission of information from the way the object is through the sense organs to, our moments of cognition, knowledge, right? The fresh news that we get from the processes that originate in sensory connections.
Right.
Yeah, some of that's mysterious, but so what? No one understands today everything that goes on in that process. But the key idea here with Nyaya is that the process, when it's working correctly, is giving us knowledge.
Right.
And so when the conditions that are in place now, and if we know something like, I don't know, the object's too far away, you've got hepatitis,
sure.
There are various things, I don't know.
Glaucoma, whatever, yeah.
I can see the two moons, et cetera, et cetera. We can identify what are called epistemic defeaters that even though any perception you take to be perceptual, produced in that, and you just sort of automatically do so, you've got a right to assert the content, the information in that.
Right.
But there are various defeaters. Some are standing defeaters, like in advance that so-and-so is a liar, so that in testimony you don't believe what that person says. But if an ordinary person says something, you just sort of you take it unless you have some reason for not believing. Same with perception. So you just sort of trust your senses unless you know that there's some special problem with the object. Like, I don't know, it's really small. We can't perceive atoms, so we have to do complicated inferences to get stuff.
Or optical illusions, right? Like optical illusions.
But they do have this whole sort of approach that it seems to me is workable as an epistemology, as a theory of knowledge, without because the details of the scientific process. Well, if we know that somebody's optic nerve is cut, I mean, they have sort of the equivalence of that. They know that people that are blind, right? Mm-hmm. They know people that are deaf. There's something wrong with their hearing organ, right? They do stuff like that, and so. But what's so great to me about classical Indian philosophy and especially epistemology is the phenomenology, right?
Okay.
Because I assume that Gangesha and so on had sense experience pretty much the way I do.
Right.
And, trees, leaves, colors.
Right.
And he's sort of talking that way. He's talking, and they, so I don't see that there's such a big obstacle to understanding what he and others have to tell us. Now, again, this has to do with everyday knowledge, not the kind of meditational knowledge.
No, and I get that. I mean, so like, I'll pose this to you. So they use the typical example of a red flower, right? But when you look at a red flower, you apprehend the color, you apprehend structure, you see all of that. But from our perspective, it looks like the flower is red, but in the scientific explanation, the flower is actually not red, right? It's the red is coming into our eyes, but it's not the flower.
But what we're interested in, is the knowledge that the flower is red.
Right.
Now, who cares how it's explained?
Okay.
When you talk to somebody like, I don't know, your girlfriend or wife, she says, I'd really like to have some red flowers.
Right.
And you say, well, that flower's red. Oh, yeah, well, that's a good one. Bring that one.
So it's not so much about...
You successfully bring the red flower. So didn't you in some way know that the flower was red.
Right.
And was it relevant to know that the red is a matter of,
No.
I don't know, photons bouncing? It's not really red in the sense that blah, 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 blah. Okay. The idea of upadhis, mind-imposed properties that the qualificandum, the tree or the flower, doesn't really possess, that's an idea that's quite current in Nyaya, right? And they're really worried about that. True universals versus mind-imposed properties, jati,
right.
As opposed to something that we impose upon the thing. But that ontological project is so fraught with difficulties that the Nayakas ultimately seem to me to sort of give it up. I don't know, Raghunatha tries to get, but so far as what we're really interested in, that is getting along in the world, action, knowledge guiding action, we can skip over some of those ontological problems. We realize that we don't get all the properties, particularly the tiny properties, relations of atoms. Look, when you see a person or the door, you don't see the backside. How much of a person, if I put my arm behind the door, right? I mean, are you seeing me or are you just seeing my arm? I mean, do you have to walk around and see my backside in order to say, hey, I saw Philip? No. Look, I mean, we're always getting certain perspectives. We never get everything.
Sure.
Right? I mean, come on. You are a sum of all kinds of time slices, right?
Right.
And, I'm getting just a few of them. But gosh, I feel like I acquainted with you now, even though it's through this medium and so on.
Yeah.
So sure, there are lots of properties that you have that and I'm not going to be aware of. So I don't get the whole thing as it is really in itself.
Right.
But really, I get enough to be able to tell Guha that I talked to you, and I probably could recognize you, and
sure.
and so forth, right?
Yeah.
And so it's at that level of communication and action.
Yeah.
Where we're making choices, not in scientific explanation. I grant you, Nyaya is trying to complete with scientific explanations. Its ontology, of 4 kinds of atoms, etc., is limited. It's I wouldn't want to try to offend too much about its various ontological positions, though I don't know, some like the qualificandum qualifier distinction. There's some really good stuff in there, really good stuff about universals. But I think it's better with the logic, epistemology, theory of knowledge, and everyday knowledge, not scientific knowledge. And I don't know. And then the deeper metaphysical questions, like, is there a Lord who decides the universe, et cetera, et cetera? Come on, those arguments are very abstract, and I don't know. They connect with arguments in the Western tradition from Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas, and on and on and on.
Right.
So no, I don't really think that. Science undercuts very much of Nyaya or even classical Indian philosophy as a whole, except in, maybe, little limited in Sankhya, in this understanding of, when you get to nature.
Yeah.
Okay. It's really proto-science. Gangesha worries a lot about some of the operations of the sense organs, and he doesn't have it right.
Right.
But so what? I mean, it's very interesting to see whether that's relevant, and I don't think it is relevant for most of the interactions we have in everyday life and everyday knowledge.
Right. Now, I want to kind of shift a little bit towards your yoga book, because the difficulty of talking about Gangesha stuff is so terse and it's very, very scholarly. Like, you have to have a somewhat understanding of the Nyaya school and Buddhist schools and other schools of Indian time around that time period to really get a sense of the theory that Gangesha is putting forward, right? So it's difficult for, I imagine most of my listeners don't have a sense of even basic Nyaya.
But if they understand that for Nyaya, there are basically three ways we know things.
Right.
Perception, inference, and testimony.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
Pratyaksha, Anumana, Shabda.
That's not arcane, right? I mean,
but that's, I mean, it's really interesting in that sense that, Nyaya has the three, Shankara has six, right? He puts analogy and comparison, and I think Smriti is the last one. Remember?
Well, there's also non-perception.
Non-perception.
How do you know that the pot is not on the floor?
Right.
I mean, is that an inference, or is that a perception, or is there some special mode of knowledge called non-perception?
Right.
That is a kind of arcane topic, I grant you.
Yeah. So, but it's interesting it's funny because I think after the Nyaya schools, primarily all the other Hindu schools or all the traditional Vedantic schools buy into the three. Only like all the Vaishnavite schools definitely, and I even think Abhinavagupta only has the three too, right? He has Pratyaksha, Anumana, Shabda.
Yeah, well, yeah, and Vaisheshika tries to eliminate testimony as a form of inference, where you know that the testifier, the speaker, is an expert, and you also believe, what experts say tend to be true, and so you make an inference of so and so has said P, so and so is an expert, so P is probably true. And Nyaya says no, it's the Mimamsakas are right. There's a special way of knowing that comes from verbal communication,
right.
And really, I mean, come on, that's a tremendously rich topic, and they make I mean, what they say about lakshana, indirect indication, is really interesting. About secondary meaning. Gangayam Gosha, the villages in the Gosha, in the Ganga, where it's really on the bank of the
Ganga, yeah.
Yeah, it's really. I mean, I know your readers might think, well, that's kind of arcane, but I think many would think that all philosophy is arcane. These are really true. Mainstream philosophic topics that are addressed by Nyaya and some of the other schools. Now, it seems to me that Vedanta, they read the Nyaya text. They learn this sort of how to reason, sort of logic 101 is Nyaya, but then they're much more concerned with something that is hard to articulate.
That's right.
Meditational experience.
Right, which is all like Shabda, basically. I mean, in some sense, yeah.
Well, Shabda in directing you to its importance and maybe how it's to be understood, but and I don't know, in Padmapada, those Mahavakyas seem to be really, super special.
Right.
But not in all Vedanta.
I will tell you my own understanding and like learning Nyaya has really helped me when I was a lawyer, when I practiced as an attorney, right?
You're a lawyer, huh?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a recovering lawyer. But it's really interesting because, like, when you look at things like the rules of evidence that these states and the federal government put out, there's so many areas where the Nyayas cover so much of this, especially when it comes to like testimony, right? Most of everything that happens in court is testimony. So how Nyaya has this entire breakdown of what qualifies as good testimony, how you should understand it. And even in the modern sense, I feel like even legal theories now about testimony are not nearly as strong as Nyaya. Nyaya has a much stronger basis of what would qualify as an authority or a testimony that should be accepted.
Right. And the basic idea with testimony is innocent until reasonably challenged. In fact, it's the idea that when somebody, unless you know something that undercuts a person's testimony, it's unlike the mainstream attitude in Western philosophy of testimony that you understand it, and then on the basis of other evidence, you accept it or not.
Right.
To some degree. The basic attitude of Nyaya is it's natural to accept what people tell you.
Right.
So what they're really interested in is when you learn that it's wrong, or how you learn that it's wrong. And so the fallacies of testimony and the fallacies of reasoning,
right,
from the Nyaya Sutra on, they have like, ways people go wrong. And so that tradition, there's a philosopher named Ananda Vaidya at, I think he's at University of California, San Jose, who he's really on a crusade to get this rich tradition of epistemic defeaters. So the idea is you get information, you get fresh news, you live by that.
Right.
People tell you so, but then you find out that it's a liar who's been telling. Then you don't believe it anymore, or you find out that there's this mistake made in the logic. Then you don't believe it anymore. So that tradition of fallacies, and so we start with something good. It's not this universal skepticism with Nyaya. We start with a presumptive attitude of knowledge that it's something good. We've got information.
Right.
And it can be undercut, and you give it up.
And I think you're really right in this, right? Like we start, even as a young kid, we start with if our parents tell us this is your father, this is your mother, you take it as
true.
Okay, that's true. Unless
it would take a lot to overthrow that.
right. Or anything about the world, anything anyone tells us about the world, don't put your hand in the fire or you'll get burnt. Well, I take that as true. I might have never experienced it. I've never had someone shoot me with a gun, but they tell me, hey, it's painful and you don't want to get shot. I'm like, I'll take it as true. Right? There's so much of the world that we take. The entire world that we build is based really on testimony, right? Because there's so much we don't experience.
That trustful attitude is natural to us.
Right. So
now, I once had a student, when I was telling this, tell me, well, that was maybe true maybe in classical Indian times, but in our age, there's just so much,
misinformation,
misinformation, BS out there that maybe we can't have that attitude anymore. I don't know.
Well, I mean, but
made me pause, I must say.
But it does make you pause to some extent. But then the tools in Nyaya give you, they should be truthful and not trying to deceive you. So that requires some level of research, and then you can determine if that, for example, right.
And also in philosophy, we're always looking at inferences.
Right.
That's how they proceed, and it's evaluating inferences and checking for fallacies is how Nyaya looks at the business of philosophy.
Right.
And I think that's taken over with the other schools. It's just that, the subject matter becomes different.
Right.
It becomes, how do we understand these injunctions to do various rituals, or how do we understand these injunctions to meditate, or et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. So in a way, Nyaya is a kind of baseline training in argument that the other schools then use in different ways, including Vedanta.
Right.
Though Vedanta is so broad, there are exceptions. It's like Sri Harsha, who we were talking about earlier. He sort of turns it all against Nyaya.
That's right.
He's so good at it. He's better than the Nyayikas, so he ends up, I don't know.
Well, I mean, Sri Harsha was before Gangesha, right? So Gangesha wrote, because Sri Harsha was between Udayana and Gangesha, I believe, right? So Gangesha probably wrote response.
Yeah. In fact, I've been told, I take it on authority, that Sri Harsha became a kind of standard text within the Nyaya schools, the tolls, this I know is true. Gangesha's son Vardhamana wrote a commentary on Sri Harsha's Kandana.
Wow.
So he took it very seriously, and Sri Harsha is mentioned by Gangesha,
Yeah.
and he tries to refute his refutation of Hridayana. And he does it, but in a very interesting way, in a pragmatic way. He says, Sri Harsha presents all this sort of standard skepticism about vyapti, natural pervasions, natural entailments that underpin inference, like wherever there's smoke, there's fire. Right. And Gangesha responds. He says, "Okay, the skeptic who wants to question, well, you haven't seen all instances of smoke, and you haven't seen all instances of fire. You can't be sure. Iron. They say everything that's earthen is scratchable by iron, but hey, then they discovered diamonds. It's not really scratchable by iron. So you can't make these generalizations," says Sri Harsha. And then Gangesha come back and he says, "Well, okay, watch the skeptic's behavior. Notice that when he wants to get smoke to get rid of mosquitoes, he starts a fire.
Right.
When he speaks to refute his opponent, he assumes that speaking is understood by the opponent, right? Yeah, and so on. So he has this kind of pragmatic refutation of Sri Harsha. Say, look, we just use these assumptions of natural entailments in our everyday life.
Right.
We could be wrong. We're not saying that we're infallible. We do learn, but again, we have the right to believe that wherever there's smoke, there's fire until we find a smokeless fire.
Right. It's really fascinating stuff. It's to me, I just find it really interesting how these people thought, and they thought deeply on real everyday experiences, because it mattered to them as to how we're engaging with the world in some sense.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah, indeed.
And I think it's really interesting. It just, especially like the 7-step syllogism that, like in the traditional Indian sense, like they have to point out the countervailing point, right? Unlike the kitchen, unlike the lake, right? The fire in the lake. It's always, it's why the mind that had to think about that as opposed to the 3-step is kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, and also, paying very close attention to inductive evidence.
Right.
Correlations that we find in nature.
So, do you have a sense of why deduction wasn't as big of a...
Well, I think there is deduction. I think the standard syllogism, the standard argument,
right,
is it's inductive. It has an inductive side to it.
Right.
It integrates induction, but at its heart, it's deductive, right? Wherever smoke, there fire. You have that universally quantified expression. Wherever S, there F,
sure.
Right? And A, the mountain is S. Therefore, it is F. That's deductive, right? That's straight. Now, in the West, logical form is abstracted away from knowledge, and so that you can have a valid argument,
right,
with premises that are not only false, but that that are false.
Like all men are good, right? That,
right? And you just follow out the implications. Well, they have that notion in classical India, but that's not what they're ultimately interested in. They're interested in knowledge, and because knowledge helps us get along in the world.
Right.
When we have successful action, it's guided by knowledge. So we're interested in logic and deduction as serving the acquisition of knowledge, so that it was not abstracted. So
sure.
Deduction was not abstracted, but it's embedded in the syllogism, or whatever you want to call that.
So in this sense, would you equate knowledge and truth together? Or is that
knowledge? Yeah, sure. You don't have knowledge if it's not true.
Right.
So they do have notion, and they worry about the nature of truth. And they sort of have a correspondence theory. This gets in to some really tough issues about qualification of the, we were talking about earlier, properties and property bearers.
Right.
And they think that a statement, perceptual statement, one known by testimony, inference will minimally have something as qualified by a qualifier.
Right.
So even a one-word statement like cow is really elliptical for something like there is a cow,
right,
or something like that. And so, which is elliptical for
that thing.
There's an individual qualified by the property being a cow.
Cow. That's right.
And so that's what it is to be true. So, and there's a lot of fighting about this. And this way, you might want to, I don't know, I just take this for granted, I must say, but the Buddhists don't. They have a pragmatic theory of truth.
Right. Which Shankara kind of takes.
Yeah, and modern people, there's a lot of talk about truth and so on, with these perspectivalism and so on. And I don't know, I don't know what to say about that. It's too hard.
Right.
I just sort of, okay, maybe this qualificandum qualifier schema that's basic to Nyaya, that
right.
underlying all information exchange, even, information originating in sense experience, all, knowledge is verbalizable in their view. And so, and whenever you say anything, you're always going to say something about something as having certain properties. So I don't know. I mean, that's just too deep for me. I mean, I know that there are, these anti-realists and so on, and even Sri Harsha attacks that it's, I don't know. It's that's a really deep issue.
Right. And just,
I don't know what I said.
So just one more question on Nyaya, and then we'll go to the yoga book. So in Nyaya, there's this idea of visheshayat, right? The objecthood or universal objecthood, correct? How would is that any way, shape, or form connected to, pun intended, the theory of forms, the Platonic theory of forms, the universal?
In the sense that Plato recognized that certain things that we say about things repeat. Right? I mean, there's certain arguments that get us to universals. This is red, that's red, that other thing is red, or here's a human being, there's a human being. I mean, gosh, we use that same idea, human being, for all these different things, all these different individuals, and they're spread out. They're not, they're not connected like a body of water or something like that. They're spread out. And so, what is it? So, there seems to be some sort of property, human beinghood, that is present in all these individual instances.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people want to say that theory of universals comes into India through Alexander's invasion of the Punjab. I don't think he got all the way. He got close. I mean, I don't think he crossed the Indus or something, because Aristotle, they knew all universal is a hot topic, right? All this repeatable properties. And, I don't know, universals of universal. I just don't really think so. I just think that that's such a common feature of language.
Right.
Repeatability of properties, that it just naturally emerges in Nyaya. The Buddhists attack it. They say all those repeatable properties, they're just mind constructed. That sort of, and then you get the Mimamsakas think the Veda is eternal and timeless, and its ideas reverberate sort of timelessly in the Akasha. So they've got to have some sort of enduring entities that words hook up to,
Right.
universals. So there's various motivations. I don't know. Some of the motivations in the Greek tradition for universals and forms seem to be the same. I don't really think there was much influence.
Okay.
I just think it's a linguistic, mainly I don't know. It's not just linguistic because, gosh, I'm looking out and I'm seeing a tree, and I know it's like that other tree.
Right.
Isn't there treehood?
Right.
There's a common characteristic there, right? So
Yeah.
it's not just linguistic. It's also perceptual.
Right. No, I agree. I agree.
So why do we have to have Aristotle's minions coming to India telling us about universals? I don't think so. I think it's a sort of naturally arising philosophical topic. Look, I don't know. I'm not a great historian of I mean, a lot of people spend a lot of time worrying about India and Greece.
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of work written on that.
I don't know. I find that boring.
You care more about the ideas than about where they came from necessarily. That's it.
Well, I don't know. I guess I just sort of think, human beings, it's our commonality as human beings we're going to arrive at a lot of common philosophic conceptions.
Right. So now jumping onto your yoga book, which I thought was actually really, really interesting and fascinating. You cover, to be honest, a whole gamut of different topics. They're all connected, but they're very deep and interesting. I mean, to be honest, the entire, like, what made you want to write this? And is it connected to any sort of practice you were doing, like yoga and thinking about?
Before I became a professional Sanskritist and philosopher, I did go to the Sri Aurobindo ashram.
Yeah.
And I even began learning a few asanas. I mean, in the ashram, the asanas weren't a very big part of it.
Yeah.
More karma yoga than anything, but also a lot of meditation. I don't know. I never lost that.
Did you get into the asana practice?
Excuse me?
Did you get into like the asana practice that we do in
the
West?
I was really happy in the 90s to see the movement of asanas. I sort of thought, gosh, when I was a graduate, I sort of thought that maybe there would be inroads into Western culture more from the top down, from these great philosophic systems.
Right.
Vedanta and the Upanishads and the Gita and Nyaya and so on. But then when it's sort of from below, right? From the popular culture. And I thought that's great because, for one thing, there were all these yoga teachers who wanted me to tell them how to pronounce the Sanskrit. A lot of free asana lessons. And I really, and I stopped correcting yoga teachers though, because it's really obnoxious.
Right.
When they would say namaste, that really bothered me. I made them say namaste instead of, nama. I know they say, what do they say?
Namaste.
They say namaste, right? Instead of no.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Namaste, right? So that was the one I yell at them. But, I don't know. But there was really this sort of new interest, and just to be honest, teaching undergraduates at the University of Texas was, a big school, 50,000 students, 30-some thousand undergraduates. There's interest in yoga, and I was a way of sort of teaching a lot of things, philosophy and history of Indian civilization. So it's sort of all packed in.
Right.
That book came out of my teaching a semester-long yoga, philosophy of yoga class at the University of Texas at Austin.
No, because like for example, in your first chapter, you spend a lot of time going through yoga like as an asana practice, and you talk about
that's a lure people in. I'm sorry. There was a reviewer from Norway or something said, "Hey, this is a really good book, but the first chapter is just terrible. It stinks. It's just some some novelistic rendition of a yoga class. Skip over that and read the rest of it. But no. It's a sort of to get the yoga teachers interested that I wasn't just.
No, because it's funny because
connection. I think there is a connection.
No,
those yoga asanas and so on. Those yoga teachers, they may not know very much, but they are many of them are really sincere teachers.
100%.
And they want more body awareness, and they want to practice pranayama. Right. So there's some academics that are specialists in yoga and tantric traditions.
Right.
I can name some names who really scoff at this popular yoga movement.
Sure.
Really phony and so on. But I don't know. I tend to be a non-elitist.
No, because I know people that are hardcore into the yoga practice of Ashtanga yoga, whatever, the asana stuff, right? And there's scenes in there where you describe, like, for example, a certain pose, and you open up the bandha, and this they had this experience. That's how they would talk constantly. So I was like, oh, you must have been like a hardcore like asana practitioner, because you kind of got all those beats exactly right. So I guess.
Those are very interesting, the bandhas, and I tell you, at first when I learned about Ashtanga yoga, which is really hard physical practice,
right?
A lot of jumping around and
Pattabhi Joyce, yeah.
I said, gosh, this is terrible that they call it Ashtanga yoga, because Ashtanga yoga is from the Yoga Sutra.
Right.
Yamas, niyamas, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, samadhi. And come on. And the yamas are ahimsa.
Right.
Right. Satya, ahimsa. This is all of ethics is an ahimsa, just about, right?
Right.
In my view. But then, so how can you call it Ashtanga? It's just this athletic practice, right? Jumping around.
Right.
Where's the dharana, right? Where's all this other stuff? But then later, after, becoming a little more mature about it, I realized that all these Ashtanga yoga teachers, they became interested in the yamas and the niyamas and so on. They weren't just interested in asana. It was really wonderful that they called it Ashtanga yoga, because they wanted to know about the tradition of the mental discipline and the swadhyaya, the self-study and so on. And they became interested in the Yoga Sutra and so on and so forth, and the Bhagavad Gita and other yogic texts. So I think it's wonderful.
No, and you're right, because it's interesting, because obviously Pattabhi Joyce he came from line Krishnamacharya, and then Krishnamacharya had that sense of the yogic tradition via Bhagavad Gita, all that stuff, right? Because even BKS Iyengar is part of that.
Yeah, Iyengar. He read the Bhagavad Gita, and
he wrote a commentary on the Yoga Sutras too.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, because you brought up a point in your conversation about samadhi, and it's actually because when I read the Yoga Sutras a couple decades ago, and I haven't really come back to that much, but I was talking to my friend who is a practitioner of Tantra, and he'd be like, I want to have siddhis, and I want to practice for siddhis. And I'm like, and my response is, no, that's a divergence away from samadhi. But the way you have the conversation in there, and over time,
I think there's something wrong in the Yoga Sutra.
But I actually think you're right in the sense where, as I read more and more of other yogic traditions, and even things like Mahabharata, and they all talk about yoga, but in different senses, that even the sense of having these siddhis, like you very clearly enunciated, a samadhi is itself a sort of siddhi, which is really fascinating way to think about it.
So it seems to me that what's happening, I think it's Yoga Sutra 337, where Patanjali says, these are siddhis to the ordinary person, but they are obstacles to the final liberation, or something like that.
Right.
It seems to me that unfortunately, he's thinking top down from the Sankhya metaphysics of the dualism of Purusha and Prakriti,
Right.
as opposed to bottom up from the practices. And, I'm sorry, I don't think Patanjali is infallible. I think he's a great yogi and so on, but I think that some of the ideas are flawed. It's, he uses the metaphysics that was available to him. I don't think he was particularly well trained as a metaphysician, and so how is it that he has the whole third book of the Yoga Sutra and many other, even a lot of the second book, all about siddhis and what comes about from a practicing ahimsa, enmity, and you get a kind of aura, right? Like Saint
Sure.
Francis Assisi, where the birds sit on his shoulder. I mean, I don't know. My wife's a little bit like that. I mean, animals, she has a certain vibe about her. She's such an ahimsaka that animals are not frightened around her.
So can I?
That seems to me a kind of siddhi. And so the idea of sort of denigrating the siddhis, which is sort of the official metaphysical position, seems to me not to square with the actual practices of yoga, where you're always developing these special talents of consciousness.
So can I throw a wrench into the mix? Because I was thinking about it, right? Coming from, obviously, this might be a chronologically probably incorrect position to take, but I was thinking about it. I'm like, so we look at the Yoga Sutras and this particular admonishment of going towards the Siddhi path versus Samadhi path. And then I was thinking, well, a lot of the mythological stories that we're told have all these beings go down the path of getting some sort of siddhi vis-a-vis yogic practice, right? And then when they go down that path of to get the siddhi, they get caught up in that particular siddhi, and they lose the sense of the oneness, and they go out and do something evil or terrible, whatever.
Even Ravana,
Ravana, right? Yeah. So I was just thinking maybe that is more of what he's inferring.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's good. That's a good correction to what I said. That's true. I like that. It could. Yeah. Surely you. I don't know. Yeah. You get a particular, I don't know, city of I don't know, dazzling people with something or other. I don't know, bending metal, something, and I don't know, you just spend your life entertaining people that way.
Right. No, and that's one of the. I mean, because I also think about it like, because I don't think Patanjali necessarily has the concept of Jiva Samadhi in his system, right? You have to at some point get rid of the body for that sense of.
Well, yeah, it's sort of like. I'm not so sure about that. He does say that clinging to life.
Yeah.
And there's such a dualism of Purusha and Prakriti.
Right.
Trenchant that, yeah, you're probably right.
But and even on your book, one of the things I actually really truly enjoyed was your kind of elucidation and kind of development of the ideas of samskaras, vyasanas, vasanas, rebirth. It was really awesome to see it in that format because it came out very easily. People get really caught up in what these things mean and how they play out. And the way you described it actually in the book was very easy to understand. I thought was very illuminating for people that want to delve into, instead of the passing comment, karma this, do this, you get karma. It's a lot more intricate and thought out of a system than people give it credit for. Or even try to think about it, right? Like one of the things that's I always, especially, and I'll put it in the modern context, when we talk about things like transgender and things of that nature, I find it, the more I think about it in terms of samskara, the more I feel connected to these people to say, just be who you are, because this is what your vasanas, your samskaras were connected to, right? It's in some ways it can be negative for people, that sometimes people treat other people like that's your fault, your issue, you handle it, as opposed to saying, this is your karma playing out, let's play it out together, let's support whatever's going on in the world. I don't know, that's just perspective.
Yeah, I think I got that I think I got that idea from Sri Aurobindo, who, like some other neo-Vedantins, I think this may be and tantrics
Yeah.
in general, but also in Buddhism, at the Bodhisattva tradition, and this is my big wind up for and here's the pitch is that rebirth is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
That sort of the standard mainstream line in all the yoga influenced traditions is you want freedom from reincarnation. But in the Bodhisattva tradition of Buddhism, and I think it's in Aurobindo, it's in some Tantra, and it's kind of implicit in the Gita also, where in chapter 6, we could talk about that. It's the idea that you are developing a unique personhood over a course of many lifetimes.
You call it soul making.
Yeah, soul making. Yeah,
Yeah.
soul making. Yeah. And I don't know, I really like that idea.
No, I think it's a great idea, because it's funny, because growing up, one of the things my father, would teach me, and we belong to the Sri Vaishnava tradition, the Vishishtadvaita tradition, and he'd be like, once you have moksha, you could come in and out of the world as you please and engage in rebirth, but you're not connected to the world in the same way, because you see it holistically as a body of God, and then rebirth
That's
no longer appears to be suffering. It is playing in the field that of the dance, the vibrations of the universe.
The divine dance,
Right. But I mean, but even the idea of soul making, I find it to be, and this was actually when I was younger, a stronger argument I would have against the concept of a God that's one and done versus a God that says, I care and love you so much. I'm going to give you all the chances.
Vishnu's right there. I mean, and all the goddesses, right, to help you along in your development. It's not just to get out of it, which doesn't quite make sense, right? I mean, why go through the whole thing if it's just to escape?
Right. And so much of the bhakti literature ends up being people saying, I don't even want moksha. I just want to be born again and again.
Even Vivekananda says.
Yeah.
Even though he's in the Shankara tradition.
Right.
He says, I don't want mukti. I want to be reborn so I can worship the Lord in all the various forms.
Right. But I thought, like, the way you laid it out, the entire soul making idea was really amazingly well done, especially because you connected to each of the yogic sense, the karmic sense, the rebirth sense. All that is.
I'll tell you, I get that mainly from Sri Aurobindo, because it is in the Western tradition, but in the West, kind of like purgatory, or I don't know whether
the Catholics had the purgatory, yeah.
They kind of have it, but they have it. What's so much better about the Indian tradition is it's here, Earth,
right?
Humans. It's not in some other. It's not somewhere else, some heaven, that's disconnected.
That's
right.
The
Earth is. I think this has ecological significance, right?
No, absolutely.
Because I think Christians can say, to hell with the earth, right? I mean, we're going to go off somewhere else anyway.
Right.
It's just some, testing ground. Whereas in a philosophy of rebirth, you're interested in this world getting better because you're going to come back.
Right.
You're going to come back. So
right.
This is where I saw it was even a little bit like Rawls's thought experiment about the foundations of justice,
right? Which is
society,
right?
Where hey, you want the laws set up where you don't know your place in society.
The veil of ignorance.
Yeah, the veil of ignorance. And that's like rebirth. You don't know where you're going to be reborn.
Right.
You're going to be reborn as a human to continue your samskars and so on, most likely. Unless you're really an awful person like Hitler or something, then I think you're born as a feral pig or something that people hunt down. But yeah. So yeah, I really like that aspect of the theodicy.
Yeah, and the thing that I got from your book, and to be honest, I think more and more writers nowadays are having this position, because before their position was the Vedantic philosophy, Hinduism, Buddhism are world denying. They all care about moksha, but the reality is like when you get into the heart of these texts and these stories and these traditions, they're world affirming. Buddhism too, very world affirming, right? The whole concept of the reason you want to get out has nothing to do with because the world is bad, is because your mental state in connection to the world is bad, right? It's the freeing up.
As good as it could be.
Yeah, it couldn't exactly. It can be better. These things can be better once you have the right perspective, right? I mean, this is why in Gita, Krishna's whole point is not to break the world, it's samadarshana. See all beings as one, right? And
loka sangraha, and you got to act and all that.
And the Buddhist concept is very similar about karunya, right?
Bodhisattva comes back again and again,
right?
With these perfect qualities that are just built for helping people.
Right. And I think I'm really enjoying the movement now towards looking again at these traditions and texts as being, how do we world affirm? Because these texts are what they're really about.
Who's really, I think, maybe central in this is Abhinavagupta.
Oh.
Because I tell you what is, maybe this is too much influenced by process philosophy of Whitehead, but the idea of the world Shri, all right, Shri, beauty, that it's a process of creating beauty,
right,
and a process of our being able to appreciate beauty, which I don't know ties in. I don't know. There's a Neo-Vedanta named he was at Madras, University of Madras. Gosh, I'm sorry. It's maybe slipping my mind right now. Who has a real good essay about beauty in Advaita.
Ananda Korsami?
No, not yeah. He's great too, but no, I'm thinking of somebody else. He was a real. It starts with an M. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine.
In any case, the idea is that the sort of raison d'etre of the world,
right,
is Shri, is the ongoing expression or creation of beauty and the appreciation of beauty.
Yeah, and that's also in Lakshmi Tantra, right? That comes out in Lakshmi Tantra very strongly, how the Prakriti, the nature, the driving force of all creation is Lakshmi or Shri. And this is why I tend to love Vishishta Dvaita and the way I interpret it. It's not necessarily the way I think most people do, is if all this is truly the body of God and the Shesha Sheshi Bhava, then all this is amazing. It's perfect. It is.
That's right.
It is a process, right? This is all God expressing himself or herself, for him and herself in the sense, in infinite ways. So how can it not be good? How can it not be great?
Yeah, it's just, hey, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Have fun.
Yeah.
Don't hurt anybody.
That's right. Now, I don't know, since you spend a lot of time with Ahimsa, did you ever look at the concept in the Mahabharata of Anir Shamshaya? And did you ever think about because I mean, Alf, I forget how to say his last name, Hiddle.
Yeah.
I always mess up the last name. But he talks about those two in conjunction with each other. So I've always found it fascinating.
Oh, I see. I read a book of his a long time ago. He's pretty good. He writes very well. Alf Hittelbeitel.
Yeah.
Something like that. Okay.
Yeah.
And what's the idea again?
The difference between Anir Shamshaya in the Mahabharata, which is non-cruelty, juxtaposed with Ahimsa, which is non-violence. one of his arguments is that Mahabharata, even though it talks about nonviolence, it's really more about non-cruelty, about how not to be cruel in the world, and how even though
Well,
violence.
I don't know the whole of the Mahabharata that well,
Okay.
but just the Bhagavad Gita, where I know Krishna does talk about does say ahimsa, and you sort of say, here it is in a war. How can you practice ahimsa?
Right. Well,
and go out and fight, but it's sort of like ahimsa on your. But to me, in India, the real contrast is between a kind of, you go back and look at the Jaina text on ahimsa.
Right.
It's more like don't hurt anybody. Don't do anything that's going to cause other people harm.
Right.
And but it's not this sort of active help people that you find in some Buddhist stuff, where compassion leads you to this more activist idea of going out and helping people.
Right.
I think ahimsa in the Yoga Sutra and yoga traditions is not. It's more Jainism.
Yeah.
It's more sort of. It's kind of a libertarian side,
Right.
Sort of let people be. You don't have to go out of your way to help them, but you surely shouldn't hurt them.
Right.
And so they have their own processes. Whereas, I don't know, the Buddhist, in a way, it seems to me that ethic of, let people follow their own way, their own dharma, is maybe more in Hindu traditions, whereas the Buddhists, they wanted to convert people. Right?
Yeah.
We got the truth. We want to, and I don't know if that's so good. I mean, I have a couple of friends who really dislike Buddhism, and particularly in their understanding in the classical context, because they're like the Muslims and the Christians. They don't leave people alone. They want to make everybody a Buddhist and so on, right? I don't know. I mean, I guess here we're getting ahimsa into politics, but
right. I mean, for me, I think those demarcations you're making are correct. Like the Jains are, let's not abstain. It's an abstention. It's not ahimsa. Is not like an active, like activism, like you're saying, and Buddhists do that. But
it's not altruistic.
Yeah. But in the Gita sense, with Loka Samgraha and Yogakshema, both those ideas. Yeah,
that's a little more, isn't it?
Yeah, that's requiring more of you, right?
Yeah, it's
a little different.
That's in the Vaishnava traditions, isn't it? I think maybe the Shaivite traditions are a little less community oriented.
Well, I mean, I don't know, because I mean, if you look at the Shaivite traditions, especially in the Tamil side too, with the what are they called? Nayanars. They're very socially conscious, and it's very concerned with social upliftment, and it's really interesting. I think there's the philosophical side of things, and then it's like how people think about the philosophy and apply it in the real world. Right? A lot of the Madhvacharya descendants, like the Purandasa, Vyasatirtha, all these are the people that were very hardcore socially conscious, always caring about people that are downtrodden and trying to uplift them. So there's like
the history is really complex.
Yeah, but I think more than anything else, these issues are not Hindu, Muslim, whatever. They're human issues, right? At some point, you look at suffering, and you just can't sit by, right?
Yeah. There's this Buddhist. Is it
Shantideva?
Yeah, I think it is, where he says, guys, there's some great lines where he says, why do we want to eliminate suffering? Just because it's suffering. Wherever suffering occurs, it's suffering. Gosh,
right.
I mean, it doesn't matter whose suffering it is. He says, we Buddhists believe that suffering doesn't belong to anyone. the individual person is really a kind of convenient, the idea is a convenient fiction. There is no enduring person. Nevertheless, suffering is bad.
But in
We
some
should
sense,
work to get rid of it.
but in some sense too, like your idea of soul making requires suffering, right? Yeah,
Suffering, at least in pain, is looked upon as a kind of instrumental good. So, because to be able to overcome it, it gives us something to overcome, and it sparks us to develop.
Which makes a lot more sense within the rebirth scenario, right? Of having lifetimes after lifetimes to refine yourself in the heat of the fire, to be the perfect steel or the wonderful glass or whatever it is you want to be. But it's that engagement with the suffering of cause.
Just simply pain. I mean, you have to learn, right? I mean, there got to be standards. Right, but you don't want to burn tissue. You don't want to stick your hand in the fire. But
good
thing that we feel pain.
It's a good thing, but it's also like the way I say it. Sometimes relationships are built stronger through going through something together, right?
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
And the relationship, maybe in the sense with God, if you go through the relationship with God through the suffering together, it reaffirms that bond, or it can break it, right? And that's really what the issue of, I think, people tend to have constantly.
Yes, and but what's so wonderful about a philosophy of rebirth is, it's never absolutely broken. You're always going to have another chance.
Krishna says that too, right? I think he says that.
What's going on? I mean, yada he dharmasya glad, and so on. I mean.
No, but he says he says
you're never lost.
Yeah, I forget what he says. It's chapter 2 or 3 where he tells Arjuna basically, whatever is gained in spiritual practice, you never lose. Yeah.
This Alpam asya dharmasya maha. It's something like saves mahabhyat. It saves from the great fear. Just a little bit of this teaching.
Yeah.
It saves from the great fear. That is, everything can contribute to your soul
growth. Yeah, exactly. Which is a beautiful concept, right? Like the pain, the pleasure. It's so life affirming.
Yeah. And the Kalarnava Tantra has that. There's a line, I have it somewhere in that book, where on the path of, everyone is on the path of Shiva. Everyone belongs to the great family, the Kula.
Yeah.
And on this path, which is not an easy path, it's like trying to hold the tail of a tiger and carry a person. It's a very hard path, but even a fall is art.
Yeah.
Even a fall is art. It's material for art.
Yeah.
So there's ultimately no way to get off the path.
It's great. And just another side note, which I really think is interesting on the philosophy side of the whole, is the demarcation of the mind from the spirit is, I think, so vitally different. You talk about the Cartesian dichotomy versus the yogic dichotomy, and I think that is such a unique way to view modern, you could talk about consciousness and consciousness studies in that way. We don't have to link the mind.
We don't have to link it to the mind the way Western.
Yeah. And I think that offers a break, a really good break in understanding what are we talking about. We're talking about consciousness.
We really need a kind of at least a tripleism, something like consciousness, mentality, and
right. The physicality.
Physicality, right?
Yeah, because I mean, in the yogic system and Sankhya system, it's the mind is a physical thing.
Side. Yeah,
but it's not physical, like touchable and stuff. But it's something.
Yeah.
But I think these concepts.
I love the concept of chitta in the yoga. Because it's part of prakriti, it's part of nature, but it's got intentionality, right?
Right.
It's not just. any old kind of nature.
Yeah, the chitta is amazing, right? Just the concept of mind, I think I find to be so fascinating when you compare it from at least the Eastern or Hindu, Jain, Buddhist thought to the Western thought of what mind is. It's
That's right.
so much more dynamic.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I agree. So again, this is maybe the Sankhya system is not the richest philosophy of India, but it should. I mean, it's sort of.
But it's like the base of most
It's
pretty much.
It's got such basic notions that, come on, any philosopher, West, East, North, South, they should know this stuff. I mean,
Right.
This again, my big axe to grind, it sort of takes us full circle, is, at least as a professional academic, is these traditions should be part of the graduate curriculum in philosophy.
Well, I mean, I think you might have made this point before, but I've definitely read it somewhere else too, is even the term when you have a philosophy department, it's automatically always philosophy of the Western world, right? It's just a Greek philosophy. And then if you want classes, you go to an Indian philosophy department, which usually might be part of religious studies or something else.
Yeah. That's where it usually is. But I think that should be broken down. And I really thank my colleagues, University of Texas, that they appointed me in a philosophy department. And,
right.
And there are a few places now that are doing that. Like, Janardhan Ganeri was just given a philosophy position at
Toronto, right?
And,
yeah.
And in Oxford with Motilal, and
right.
after that, and so it's gradually happening. But even in India, there needs to be more integration.
Yeah, India it's such a weird thing to me, because even when we're talking about Ramanuja Tatacharya and the other panditas that you learn from acharyas, they should be equivalent of PhDs in these subjects sitting in a university.
And they weren't paid that, but they're not paid like PhDs.
But not even paid. Many people don't even cite them when they.
No. That's right. They don't pay attention to them.
And that's sad. It is sad. So much information and knowledge that these people have. And I mean, to be honest, they're walking encyclopedias of information.
That's right. That guy, I'm telling you, Ramanuja Tatacharya and some of the traditional pundits, gosh, unbelievably studious.
Yeah.
I mean, have worked so hard and brilliant. I don't know. I don't know. Also, I love Sanskrit. I mean, Sanskrit's a great language.
No, I love Sanskrit. I love the Indian tradition. I also love, I love medieval European philosophy. I love continental philosophy. Spinoza is my man. When it comes to continental philosophy, I really enjoy his work. I mean, I don't agree with everything, but I really enjoy what he brings to that table.
That's great.
I did my master's in continental philosophy.
Oh, really?
But I didn't finish it. I have a couple of vices, which includes drinking. So I think that prevented me when I was in law school from finishing that. But I really.
So you're a recovering lawyer.
That's right. And I loved, one of my papers I did in my grad program was comparison between Shankara and Martin Heidegger. I thought being in time and the concept of logos and how that plays with Brahman concept was very interesting to me in the play between those two.
Yeah, I don't really know much about that. I mean, it's like there was so much to yell and scream about in classical India and being a Sanskritist that I'm a little, and then I at Harvard and Texas, strong analytic department. I'm really a little short on continental.
I mean, for me, if these things are universally true, they must exist in all cultures and all different thought processes.
I know. I must say I really love some of the existentialist. I know the novels of Camus.
Yeah.
Some of Sartre's stuff. It's really, really, really great. Sort of, it's
right. So I've taken up a lot of your.
Yeah, and by the way, those existentialists, they do value, consciousness. They're not, like what is absurd are atoms and science. Camus says, I look at my hand, it's supposed to be made of atoms. I can no way relate to my hand being made out of atoms.
Right.
It's just totally absurd to me. I have to make choices on the basis of, the way things appear. Appearances in the phenomenal world, appearances are reality. And so to hell with science. And so in a way that really, with the emphasis on experience and, the lived life, they're kind of coming together with the Indian traditions.
Well, it came together with Schopenhauer, and then the existentialists, phenomenalists kind of have a line from Schopenhauer to them, right? So Schopenhauer brought in the Vedantic Buddhist idea of mind and all that stuff.
But maybe not in the greatest ways.
No. I'm not saying that, but it's just there's that connection where it's a sort of. But I've taken up so much of your time, Professor. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else that you think that you want to talk about or bring up?
Hey, that's what I do, talk. So
I appreciate it. It was wonderful to read your books and have a conversation with you. But I will get that other book that you put out, the Rutledge, the one epistemology of.
Oh yeah, my 3 volumes.
Right. So are you working? So you're working on anything else right now?
Yeah. Well, I just had what I sent you on. I'm actually working on. I'm reading Shankara's commentaries on the Upanishads, and I think what I'm going to do is read every commentary in Sanskrit that I can get my hands on the Isha Upanishad, and just focus on Isha Upanishad. Like I say, I'm tempted to do Sri Harsha, but Sri Harsha is actually really hard. He's such a good poet. Most philosophers, like Gangesha, he has some long, complicated thoughts and long, complicated sentences, but his vocabulary is not all that rich. I didn't have to look up a lot of words in dictionaries and so on.
Right.
Whereas Sri Harsha is a poet. And even in Kanda Kadya, he's always playing with you. And he has these, shades of meaning, and he has a lot of, Sanskrit's got a really rich, and so you have to spend a lot of time in the dictionary. and whereas Shankara is, as a prose stylist,
right,
is absolutely clear. There's, he's like a model of lucidity.
Right.
And so it's pretty easy to read. And I don't know, I also love the Isha Upanishad. So I've decided to work on that and not Sri Harsha. But I don't know, maybe I'll change my mind. But it's really nice, even though, gosh, I've made a living talking. I haven't talked now for a few months to anyone, not except you. And I must say, it's kind of nice not to have to get up and lecture every day like I used to.
Right.
I'm retired, and so I have a lot more time.
So aside from the Sanskrit text and reading, what else are you going to do with your retirement time?
Oh, I don't know, working the lawn, this is, I know it sounds like terrible indulgence, but when we remodeled this old adobe house in New Mexico, I got a special on a sauna. So I know this, this Bikram yoga is sort of been criticized as maybe not the healthiest way, but I really like getting very hot and then doing asanas. So you get because they're easier, right?
Right.
when you go into a sauna and you get really hot, it's easier to stretch and so I'm enjoying that.
Well, good luck with that, and thank you so much for your time and your patience. But I will definitely keep in touch, and thank you for everything. I appreciate it.
All right.
Namaste.
Om Shanti.
Pushpa sugandha sumalaya samire पावन मुनिजन यमुना तीरे, पावन मुनिजन यमुना तीरे, गायती वनमाली, गायती वनमाली, मधुरं गायती वन